Hermione's Song, Chapter 23. Malfoy Manor, Wiltshire. Lucius Malfoy trailed behind his master, Lord Voldemort, as they made their way to the formal dining hall of the Malfoy family home. He felt honored that the Dark Lord had chosen his house as a base of operations for the Death Eaters, even if it did mean always keeping on one's toes so as not to irritate him. Lucius was horror-stricken when they reached the large ebony doors of the dining room. He saw there was a small layer of dust on the ornate carvings lining the doors. It was just one more reason to hate the Potter brat for stealing his house elf away from him. He wanted everything to be perfect during his master's stay. Voldemort was able to sense his servant's unease. Ever since he had been a little boy, he had the ability to notice small things that everyone else failed to see. The slight twinge of a cheek muscle as someone was lying, the way a person's pupils dilated when scared, or the shade that had appeared to him when he was in the orphanage. He paused briefly as he wondered what had brought up that particular memory. To distract himself, Voldemort ran his finger along one rather interesting carving depicting the original enslavement of the house elves. He held up his pale finger and grimaced at the dust. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched as Lucius turned several shades of red. Personally, Voldemort didn't care one way or the other about dust. He just liked watching those who served him squirm. Lucius was about to apologize for the dust, but Voldemort held up a hand for him to remain silent. With the same hand, he made a small gesture and the doors flew open. Lucius was unable to hide his shock when he saw that his rather large dining room had been magically altered to make it even more spacious. It took him a moment to realize the room had been changed so that it now matched the dimensions of the Great Hall at Hogwarts perfectly. Eventually, he noticed that several other Death Eaters were already in the room. The elder Crabbe and Goyle stood next to a table filled with food, looking ever so much like their equally dim-witted sons. Wormtail cowered in the far corner, taking long sips from a vintage fire whiskey bottle he had swiped from Lucius's well-stocked wine cellar. Bellatrix Lestrange, his mentally unhinged sister-in-law, was leaning against one wall, calmly cleaning under her fingernails with a dagger. Lucius knew that dagger had been used earlier that day to cut off a man's tongue after he had dared to question their lord. The rest of the assembled Death Eaters were of no consequence, and were viewed as cannon fodder by the inner circle. Lucius stepped closer to Voldemort. "My lord, I still don't understand what we are doing here tonight," he whispered subserviently. Voldemort sighed, and rubbed the spot directly between his eyes, where the bridge of his nose would have been if he had had one, as if he were starting to get a headache.
"That doesn't surprise me, Lucius, seeing as you've never given me reason to think you were bright enough to comprehend the full extent of my plans," he said softly. Turning ever so slightly so that Lucius could see the disdain in his eyes, Voldemort went on. "If we wish to succeed in our endeavors easily, we must get to know our enemy," he explained slowly. "We have observed the boy, and those who help him during what could be considered bad times for them. To truly know them, we must observe them in their good times as well," he told him. Bellatrix sheathed her dagger and sauntered over to him.
"Besides, we might get to watch some poor student get their hearts stomped on by their date,"
she said hopefully.
"A school dance is always good for that sort of misery,"
she sighed longingly. Voldemort smiled at his greatest creation. He had broken both her mind and soul, and then put them back together just as he wanted them. Bellatrix belonged to him completely.
"Yes, my dear, you are quite correct," he told her. "Those of you here with me tonight should keep your eyes out for anything like that. We can use that hurt and pain to our advantage in recruiting new members from within the school. Hell hath no fury, etc., etc.,
he instructed with a dismissive wave of his hand. As if on cue, the gems in the corners began to glow with a pale red light.
"Ah, let the ball commence,"
he said while snapping his long, thin fingers. The interior of the Malfoy dining room shifted and blurred until it looked like they were standing in the warmly lit Great Hall of Hogwarts. Brown and orange banners hung from the ceilings. Ghostly images of those in the real hall walked around, completely oblivious that they were being watched. Crabbe gibbered in fear as a student walked through him. Voldemort turned around slowly and smiled at the level of depth Snape's transfer gems provided.
When the boy and his friends arrive, I will assign each of you one of them. Make sure you stay with him the entire time during the ball, he instructed his followers. Lucius, I want you to follow the Weasley boy and report back to me of all of his social blunders. I'm sure he will do something we can use against him later, he stated. Pointing at Bellatrix, he said, I want you to follow the Mudblood. From what I've heard, she has a tendency to get her heart broken at these affairs, much like you described earlier.
Bellatrix nodded and smiled, the naughty, voyeuristic aspect of what they were doing appealing to her.
As for the boy himself, I will study him,
Voldemort proclaimed. He made brief eye contact with Wormtail.
Keep an eye on Dumbledore, and try not to piss yourself every time he glances in your direction. We're not really there, so he can't see you, he said acidly. The rest of you, mingle and keep your eyes open, he ordered.
Bellatrix's distinctive laugh caught Voldemort's attention.
The little mudblood is here with a man much older than her,
she exclaimed happily.
I don't see how that could possibly end well.
She told no one in particular. She skipped over to the image of Hermione and danced around her, making faces. Voldemort ignored her and stepped closer to the Great Hall's door so he could see when Potter arrived. He was no longer in earshot of the Mudblood, but he trusted his second-in-command to observe everything, even if she was busy taunting an illusion. The doors opened, and Voldemort stiffened. He had no idea why the sight of the mangy werewolf in a gray suit with a silly sweater on under it angered him so much. The Auror Tonks outfit equally appalled him. The flight jacket with its many patches boasting of the Muggle's exploits off this ball of dirt made him want to step over and slap her face. He was concerned that he was experiencing what he thought were irrational feelings. Neither Lupin nor Tonks posed any real threat to him, so all he should have been feeling was contempt. The two images that disturbed him so much walked through him to join the Mudblood and her new suitor, while he tried to pin down why he was feeling this way. The next couple that walked through the door was Ron Weasley and Luna Lovegood. Once again, Voldemort felt emotions that seemed to be totally out of place. The sight of how the Weasley boy and his date were dressed made the corners of his mouth tilt upwards, the closest thing to a smile the Dark Lord had experienced all week. Voldemort quickly regained control when Lucius stepped up next to him, ready to start watching the red-headed fool.
What on earth is that idiot wearing?
Lucius asked scornfully. Voldemort glared at Lucius, causing the other man to step back involuntarily.
It's a cricket uniform, he stated coldly. I used to be quite good at that game in my youth, he told Lucius. Now where did that come from?
Voldemort wondered. He had never played a single game of any team sport growing up, let alone a Muggle one.
Forgive me, my lord,
Lucius groveled, and then hurried away to follow Ron. Voldemort turned around suddenly when the image of the Mudblood state called out,
Look at me! I'm Rude and Ginger!
The notion that the cricket uniform belonged to the man made Voldemort very curious. He stepped down into the Great Hall and walked closer to the man as the images of Ron and Luna passed through him on their way to the same location. Voldemort saw movement out of the corner of his eye, and he turned to stare at a singularly odd sight in the doorway. A person dressed up as a large penguin stood framed by the open doors. The Mudblood state exclaimed, Frobisher! Again, a slight smile played across the Dark Lord's lips. When the woman dressed as the penguin took off her fake head, Voldemort's smile evaporated. He was saved from having to examine his now angry mood by Bellatrix stomping her foot in anger.
That's not fair. I killed that bitch,
she pouted.
That's not like you, Bellatrix,
Lucius teased.
You're usually much more thorough with those type of things,
he joked.
Who is this woman?
Voldemort demanded. Bellatrix left Hermione's side and stalked towards the woman in the penguin suit.
She is, or rather was, my cousin's fiancée,
she explained. Her expression became more thoughtful as she made eye contact with Wormtail. His face was pale, and his hands were shaking more than usual.
I wonder if she knows it was you, rather than the blood traitor who delivered the potters to our Lord,
she cackled. Voldemort turned to look at his most loyal servant. Bellatrix's question caused Wormtail to shake so bad he dropped the fire whiskey, shattering it on the floor.
My lord, the boy is here,
Wormtail stammered, glad to have the subject changed. He pointed a dirty finger at the doorway. Voldemort slowly turned around. When he caught sight of Harry's costume, he became enraged.
How dare he wear that scarf?
He yelled. Harry was dressed in a brown suit with a very long scarf draped over him. Voldemort was beyond wondering why he considered that scarf his favorite, when the only scarf he had ever owned was the green one that came with his Slytherin uniform. All he could think of was his mortal enemy wearing the scarf.